could be a whole weekend workshop of material because of the number of people. So what I've done today is I've tried to create a presentation so that we get some visuals of what's going on. So inshallah, I will begin. So America and the history thereof. So we first start with Zheng He, and he was actually a Chinese explorer. His original name was actually Ma, which is actually Muhammad. It is a translation or a Chinese version of Muhammad. And his name was eventually changed by the emperor to Zheng He. He led 7 expeditions all around the world. He circumnavigated the world. He went around the Indian subcontinent. He went all the way to basically up the Suez and all of those areas. And there's also some indication that he actually made his way to the United States. This is an example of the ship that was built. The ship that was built was basically the size of, it was bigger than a football field or a pitch. This was 400 feet. So this was something that is massive. So, you know, you can look it up, and then there's a lot of Western, scholars out there that kind of try to refute this. But lately, they have actually dug up some of the artifacts, which is the rudder. So the back area of the ship, which controls the steering, they actually found over a foot section of the rudder, and it actually, which is one single piece of wood, they actually said that based on that, it could be indicated that this was built. Again, Winston Churchill said the victor, the person who is victorious always writes history, right? The winner writes history. So a lot of these things have either been covered up or lost to history, and some people like to refute it because they're like, well, if we don't have something we can touch and feel, it's not enough that this was written in multiple instances and we have pictographs and things like that. And then even when they found the rudder, they still are refuting it because, again, what they're comparing it to is Europe. They're talking about the West. Where was the West at this time in the heyday of Islam? They were still dealing with pestilence. They were dealing with the Black Plague. They were dealing with these instances. They still didn't have running water. They didn't have sewer systems. While in Andalusia, they had these things for hundreds of years before what we consider the West or Europe. Western Europe had these things. So they're always basing the context on these things on where was Europe? Was the technology available? So Zheng He, this is a map that was actually created, and then this is also another map. And you can actually see the map here that is the United States, basically. The North America and South America. Of course, it's not fully accurate, but this was during the era of Zheng He, and this is basically a picture of him. They took creatures like giraffes and elephants, and you can this is a smaller image, but they had rhinoceros. They actually took with them animals because these ships were so massive. And we're not talking about one. We're talking about an armada, hundreds and hundreds of ships. So that's Zheng He. Who has heard of Mansa Musa or Mansa Abu Bakr? Okay, a few of you. So Mansa Musa and Mansa Abu Bakr, famous Mali kings. So we know that Islam went all the way through, to Spain, but sometimes we forget that Islam also went south in Africa. And it went into the Mali kingdom, the Mandingo, Senegal, Gambia, Mali, all of these areas. These areas were larger. The land mass that we're talking about is significant. Maybe at the end of the presentation, I'll show you what a real map of the world looks like. Africa is much larger than it appears on all the maps that we see. So it's very it's very telling. You could probably fit about 3 United States or 4 within the boundaries of Africa, right? But it looks like the United States is the same size as Africa on the map, right? That's not correct. So these land masses were huge. So Mensa Abu Bakr was the brother and leader prior to Mensa Musa, who is a little bit more famous. And the reason why, we'll get into why Mensa Musa is a little bit more famous. Mensa Abu Bakr sent like basically a convoy of ships, 600 ships, to the United States and the area that we know as the United States. He said, don't come back until you have discovered, you've discovered the land and that type of thing, or you've found riches and you've established a trade. No one came back from that voyage. So Mensa Abu Bakr, who was the leader at that time, abdicated the throne. He actually stepped down. And what he did was he said, this is not enough for me. I sent these people. I need to see what happened to them. So this time, he created a fleet of 2,000 ships, 2,000. 1,000 for all of the people, and 1,000 for all of the supplies and everything that they would need. And he said, I will not return what he told the people that he had sent on the first voyage. He said, I will not return until I have established a trade route or we have found the riches and that type of thing. So this is kind of like a pictograph of the Mensa Abu Bakr. And then this is also like basically a pictograph of them meeting the Native Americans. And we find that the Seminoles in Florida, which is where I'm from, the Cherokee Nation, and some of the Native Americans that were in Southwest Arizona, New Mexico, they found evidence, and I'll show you some of that, of this interaction between the different tribes, essentially, and that it was no mistake. That they say, well, it has to have been from the city of Atlantis, or it had to have been when all of the world was connected, and they don't want to talk about the fact that there was technology that would have allowed people to actually make the trip from Africa and from China the other way to what we call America now. The other thing is Mensa Musa. So we'll talk about the riches. The land was bountiful. There was lots of trees. There's lots of gold. Mensa Musa, they said, was so rich, he created a economic disturbance across Africa all the way to Hajj. He made Hajj. He took 60,000 people with him on Hajj himself. And you can see this is a graphic of the amount of people. When they say afwaj, when they say tons and tons of people, waves of people, that's how it was. He wrecked the economy of even Cairo. He gave so much sadaqah, so much charity. They had camels that were just carrying hundreds of pounds of gold because of the amount of gold that was in that area and the trade routes that they had established. So Mensa Musa was able to do this through these riches and the splendor that was Islam and the correct guidance. And they were both just Mandingo. This will come back. So remember this Mandingo name, because it's going to come back. And it's going to be very important as we move forward. So we see this is also a pictograph of them sailing. This is the type of ships that they took on their voyage, different than the Chinese explorer. But this was 1,000 ships for people and 1,000 ships for supplies, Mensa Abu Bakr. This is also kind of like a pictographic evidence and information that talks about Mensa Abu Bakr, Mensa Musa going to Hajj, taking that many people and basically causing inflation anywhere he went because of the amount of gold and abundance that they had had. So this is when I discuss the evidence. Here's evidence from the southwest of the United States. This is cave scrolls, like they scrawled on the walls, engravings in this area. This is in the southwest in Arizona. This was also found in Arizona, New Mexico area. Again, when we talk about the boundaries, these are all man-made creations. So these are all kind of like the same area. This is called the elephant tablet. This elephant tablet on the top right, they basically took it, and this was found in the United States, right? So then for a very long time, they didn't understand why and how, like what did this mean? And then they saw elephants. So you can kind of see the pictograph of the elephant. This white part is basically a rendering or a drawing of what's on the tablet, because the tablet's hard to see. And then this is they also translated it. So you can see that they have rhinoceros, they have elephants with their tusks. So what they were saying, the Western archaeologists were saying, well, you know what? This means that there was elephants that existed in prehistoric times in this area. And, you know, there's evidence that Thomas Jefferson sent an archaeological dig to actually go and do this. There may be indications of that, but actually written on this tablet refutes all of that. It throws it out the window. And again, a lot of these things are very controversial. If you go online, you'll find 100 websites and hundreds of books that try to refute this evidence and shape it and spin it into something that it's not necessarily true. So they kind of write it off. But this tablet, what does it say? This tablet, the rough translation out, it says, the desert is hot birds are numerous. So it basically it goes from the top left down. It's hot birds and numerous, white. Just go in our language. The elephants are sick and angry. Elephants are sick and angry. How could the elephants be sick and angry if they died millions of years ago and they're bones? That doesn't make sense. At present, the sick elephants are considerable. Again, how does this make sense if we're talking about bones? Life is spent removing the sick elephants dried up by the sun. Many are sick. The dead elephants are pushed down into a hole and buried and sealed in the terrain. And it continues, and it talks about uncultivated land, hunt the birds, cook the elephants. It's easy to roast, grow on the flat terrain, the maize, the corn, and the uncultivated land. There are also bears. So they're talking about things. There's not bears. Where are the bears in Africa? I'm not aware that there's those types of bears in Africa. So we're talking about them, you know, contemporaneously writing into this tablet that they had elephants with them. And when they brought them, the land was different because, you know, Arizona and New Mexico, it's not like Africa where there's the rainy season and then the land becomes lush and there's vegetation, etc. We're talking about an arid desert. And so basically it was an instruction that, you know, hunt the birds. So the first tablet talks about the birds and that they should hunt them, not just look at them. And that they're dying, eat the elephants. And then eat it with the corn that they have there and the corn known with the Native Americans in that area. So this also evidence as well, more in regards to this actually is something from Africa during that time that is confirmed from Africa in Africa. But basically the scrawling and the writing is the same. So it was actually a Mali-based language. It's spelled V-A-I. I don't know how to pronounce it, maybe Vi. But it was basically a pictographic language that Mali and the Senegambian region, they used before they got Arabic and before they had language in a written way. So this is something kind of like, you know, you have Berber in Morocco. It's something that is native to that area before Arabic came. So this same scrawling, the same drawings was what was found in Southwest United States currently. So this is again further evidence that not only did they come here, they stayed. So we go back, if we go back to Mensa Abu Bakr, Mensa Abu Bakr actually, only one ship came back. Only one ship. Out of the 2,000, 1,999 didn't come back. What happened? He said they went up the Mississippi. They crossed, they basically spread through the land, and they got absorbed into the peoples. They made trade, started intermarrying. Again, more evidence that they're finding now lineage. If someone goes on Ancestry.com, they're finding it's someone that's white and they're known to be Caucasian, right? Well, they're actually finding that they have Turkish bloodlines because these explorers were actually coming over, becoming part of the people, and over time, as the generations, you had basically a split. You had like darker skin color split and a lighter skin color split, and these people lost to history were these people, these ancestors. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So, inshallah, what I want to change gears, and I want to start talking about the slave trade. So as we move forward, right, we talked about how the African kingdoms and Chinese kingdom, Muslim explorers made the trek to the United States, got absorbed into the culture. Even some of the clothes of the Cherokee Nation, the Seminole Nation, you find that they have some of their clothes is very, very similar to African dress. So that was kind of like that first period. So as we move along, we now start going to the period. So we had the before 1776, okay? This time in the world. During this time, there's a lot of warring tribes and a lot of nations that were basically fighting with one another. So we talked about the kingdoms of Mali, right? We talked about what ended up happening was after Mansa Musa passed away, his sons started fighting with one another, and it started devolving into, you know, what we understand to be the African history. But again, that was not how it always was. And again, that was also due to foreign influences, etc. The other thing to note was the Ottoman Empire, because we're talking about like the Khilafah that was instituted all the way to Andalusia, right? The Khilafah did not, the Ottoman Empire that took over basically the Khilafah did not extend down into sub-Saharan Africa. So they started losing that connection. And they started having foreign people and then people that were Muslim and non-Muslim, people that started warring with one another. So at 1776, what ends up happening is we start going into the second phase. Second phase is a really hard period. We talked about the pre-Columbus era. So we've established Muslims were here many hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus, okay? So America's history doesn't start in 1492. It starts many years before. So what happened as we move forward? In the 1500s, 1600s and onwards, we start getting the Inquisition, right? That happened in 1492. And what ended up happening was Muslims were kicked out of and basically assassinated. There was a genocide in the area of Portugal and like Spain. So actually, a lot of Muslims fled that area. A lot of Jews also left that area, and that's why you actually find that in a lot of Muslim countries, there's still pockets, heavy pockets of Jews that are in those areas, like Tunisia, like Morocco. Why? The Muslims protected them. So even after they were kicked out of Spain and Portugal, they came over and sought refuge, freedom of practice. So actually to this day, alhamdulillah, my wife's Tunisian, there's actually a place in Tunisia that they actually do a pilgrimage to. It's a site where they basically built their first synagogue there, and it's a religious holy site for Jews in that area. So as we move forward, right, the conquistadors, so the Spanish started going into the areas of Africa, and the British started going into the areas of Africa, right? And they started warring, and they started basically making trade. But what did they do? They were actually trying to get their resources by force. So they would, contribute and help out certain tribes to take over their other tribes. They basically wanted them to eliminate one another. So there were people that called themselves Muslim that participated in this, unfortunately. At that time, there's lots of prisoners of war, and when they were warring, etc., they would sell them into slavery. The one thing that I would want to say here is, though, when it comes to the slavery that they understood, it was the slavery of the time of the prophets, slavery. They didn't understand and it's not necessarily giving an excuse, it's just putting this into context. No one saw on earth, what was the hemisphere, in the United States, in the South America. Even South America was a little bit better. But no one saw that. No one understood that that's what slavery had become when they were doing this. The slavery that they were talking about was, like you say, faqu raqaba, free a slave. It was more like, with some respect, they lived somewhat of like a decent life. Here, no such thing. That's why even when in the context of talking about Islam and slavery, it's very, very important that you don't just translate directly and you say slave, Bilal was a slave. Like, it's very important. The things that happened to Bilal was happening everywhere when it came to this period of time. And everyone was treated like that. It wasn't just servitude and that type of thing that we saw in other eras. So what would happen? So the slave trade happens. 12.5 million Americans, or what would become Americans, 12.5 million people actually were shipped. There's a lot of discrepancy on how many people actually died. The numbers range between 2 and 6 million people died from the time that they were captured as prisoners of war to the time that they made it over to this area. Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, the United States, South America. So 2 million is what they're now saying. So, and we know, you can go and look at the pictures on how they basically put them in like sardines, like a canned fish on the ships. Thousands of people basically on top of each other, chained, making that voyage, very treacherous voyage. So the one thing is, again, we don't really know. It could be 4 to 10 times that amount. So there's not necessarily a really great record of what happened. So we're saying there's 12 million. Well, it could be more like 50 million. And we're saying that it was about 2 million that may have died. It could have been up to 10 million that died along the way. So we're not exactly sure because the records have been lost. So as we move forward, I wanted to make that distinction, and I also wanted to make the distinction between the Portuguese and Spanish ones that were the British that became America, right? The United States of America. Slavery was very different in those areas. In Brazil, which was a Spanish colonies, Trinidad, and those types of places, Muslims came over. They were part of the slave trade. They had more freedom. It wasn't full freedom, but it was more freedom to practice their religion. They were more allowed to gather as the same types of people, unlike what happened in what we call the United States now, and I'll come back to that. So in Brazil, the hundreds of Muslims actually were expelled. Why? Because they were actually fighting. The Muslims the Muslim slaves actually freed themselves because they paid, again, very different than the United States. They were able to buy their freedom. So they became powerful, and they actually started protecting the people, like minorities and people that were oppressed in the Brazilian areas, the other people that weren't free. And they basically, the Brazilians at that time, during the colony, basically said, we don't want, these guys are troublemakers. We want to continue what we're doing, and we don't want this rebellion. So what they did was they took hundreds of ships and actually deported all of the Muslims, African Muslims, back to Africa, right? That sounds like miraculous compared to what they used to do in the United States, right? So they were able to gain their freedom and return to Africa. And you see that there actually is a mosques that are actually speak Portuguese in Western Africa because of that reason. They went back, they spoke Portuguese, and they were from that area. So now let's go back to the North America. There is a lot of graphic details, and and look at those things. I opted not to put some of those types of images because they are very, very disturbing. But I'll just give you kind of an idea of the way that slavery worked in the United States. It was the worst kind of slavery, unlike the slavery that the world had ever seen, like I had said. The slaves that were brought here to the United States were purposely targeted to make sure that the slaves that would go to certain areas would not know each other, that they would, if they were from the same area or spoke the same language, they would try to avoid having those people be together. They wouldn't even send them to the same towns. People would refuse to even have it in such a sense that they would allow to be communicating. They were not allowed to speak their language. They were not allowed to write. And a lot of these, like we said, were Muslims. So they wrote and spoke Arabic. And we're going to go into the details of some of these notable people. But the idea is that they basically destroyed them. What they did was they broke all of these people down to their core, and they changed their names. They weren't allowed to choose their names. In Brazil, some of these areas, like the islands, they kept their names or they kind of westernized them. So Ayub would be Job, Sulaiman would be Solomon, Mahmud, Yaro Mahmud would be Mahmud, right? So they would try. Some succeeded in America, but most didn't, to try to keep those roots. So as we move forward, there's a collections and stories of American Muslims exhibition, and it goes around the United States. They have different evidences of these early writings because, again, there's controversy. People say, what, these weren't Muslims? Muslims were the people that were selling everybody into slave trade. They were part of it, and there were people that were non-Muslims, but a lot of Muslims were sold into the slave trade. Lots. So we said the estimates, again, it depends on what your source is. Some say 10%, some say 30% of all of, so 1 in 3. So basically the way it is look to your left and look to your right. If that person wasn't a Muslim, it would be you. That's how many people were Muslims for the most acknowledged number. Some say it could have been up to 70%. But again, the record keeping is so poor because they made them change their names. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to pray. They weren't allowed to fast. They're force-fed pork, etc. in many instances. And again, there's also a difference between the south and the north, which we'll get into inshallah. So we first go into Yaro Mamut, okay? He wasn't married and he didn't have a family, but he lived an Islamic way of life. Yaro Mamut was, he lived in the Washington, D.C. Has anyone heard of Georgetown? Georgetown, the university? Georgetown, Washington, D.C., he lived in that area. And he was known in that area to not eat pork. So he would go talk to the butchers and say, I don't want pork, which was something weird. It was a very weird thing for them. So he also was remembered. Other people reported that he was doing dhikr. He was saying this weird stuff over and over and over again all day. So he was saying, you know, subhanallah and different adhkar all day. So it was reported not just by him, by others, that he was doing this thing, this weird thing. So people would actually go and they say, you know, he's a good guy. He's a really good guy, but he's weird. He's a weird guy. You know, a few times a day, he bangs his head on the ground. We don't know what he's doing. You know, at different times in the day, he doesn't eat pork. He speaks in this weird language that we've never heard of. We don't know. He's a good guy. He's a good guy, but he's weird. So he was known for that. So it was reported by many people that Yaro was Muslim. Okay. Now we go to, has anyone heard of Prince Among Slaves? It was a movie that they created, PBS. Yes. So this is Abdurrahman Ibrahim ibn Sori. He was the prince among slaves. He was actually a prince and he was captured. And again, this is what I'm saying is that this was Muslims that were sold into the slave trade and they weren't just, a lot of them were not just normal people. A lot of these people were actually scholars. They were, you know, royalty. They were learned people. He was born in Timbo. He was considered a Fulani in Guinea. And he was enslaved in Mississippi. This is some of his writings that you can see. He knew Arabic and English. So Abdurrahman, son of Ibrahim, I born in city of Timbuktu, and it just goes on, and he talks about it, and he wrote it in Arabic as well. So these are actually his writings that was found. And again, many prayers, and then he also wrote something to his father saying, or the Lord's Prayer, Salah. So he still kept his Islam even with the terrible conditions that we had. All right, so let me continue. So that was Ibrahim Sori, and he served as a slave for 40 years. One of these letters actually went to the Sultan of Morocco. Very important. Does anyone know why the Sultan of Morocco was so important to the United States history? Yes. Correct. Mm-hmm. Yes. Correct. So the queen actually used to pay jizya. She used to pay a tax, so that they would not attack the ships through the shipping lanes. The other reason why this is important is that Sultan was the first ruler and first country to acknowledge the United States of America. So when it's Britain is the most powerful superpower, right? or one of them. You know, it depends on who you ask. Ask the Spanish or ask the French, they may disagree, right? But at that time, they were one of the most powerful. When America broke off as a colony, it was like, I'm not gonna say that they're, because they also had colonies. France and Spain and the other countries, even the Dutch and the Germans, had colonies. And they're like, we don't want a rebellion. We don't want these people in these countries to start becoming independent. So they were all scared, right? The Sultan of Morocco officially was the first person, the first state Muslim country to acknowledge the United States of America, and they did a peace treaty that actually still stands to today. And if you actually haven't heard of the United States Marines, the United States Marines, they're one of the, you know, in their formal military dress, the United States Marines have a saber, right? They have a sword that they walk with. The reason that is that connection with the countries, Morocco, Libya, and that the strong bond that those Muslim countries had with the United States. And it was actually gifted to the generals, and they incorporated that into their dress. There's about 550 or so cities in the United States that have Arab or Muslim city names. You may have seen them: Lebanon, Egypt. There's other places. There's Arabi. There's lots and lots of cities and areas that are called Muslim names because of that strong bond that we had. So again, so when people say America's always been at war with Islam and Muslims, no, we've actually, since the creation of the United States, we actually were the people that supported the United States. We helped the United States, and we were the ones that were the first allies of the United States. So that's Islam, and that's our roots here. So remember that as a point. So Ibrahim Asori wrote, one of these letters he wrote to the Sultan of Morocco. Sultan of Morocco, of course, we said strong bond, right? He wrote to the president. I think it was John Quincy Adams at that time. He wrote to the president, immediately sought to free Prince Ibrahim Asori. So that was that strong bond, that just one letter was able to do that. All right, so next we have Ayub, like I said, Job, Sulaiman or Solomon. Basically, but this one basically has his writing in Arabic. And his story. He was captured in Gambia. So again, we're talking about different countries. It wasn't just one country. We're talking about a large portion of Africa where these things took place. He was brought as a slave to Annapolis, Maryland. He wrote a letter to his father in Arabic, which is what you see. This letter came to the attention of a guy called James Oglethorpe. James Oglethorpe, long story short, he was the guy who founded the state of Georgia. It's right north of us, north of Florida. And he basically petitioned to get him free. And he was able to get him free. Ayub ibn Sulaiman, then he asked him, he's like, you're free now, you can do whatever you want, but I'd like you to come work for me. So he actually sent him to London to become basically an ambassador, in a sense, between London Company and Africa. So he would travel between London and Africa. While in London, he wrote 3 copies of the Quran from memory. And it was documented in his his slave memoir that's what happened. So again, we said the history of the people that came to the United States, just like it is now, is a lot of these Muslims were exceptional. They were scholars. They were learned. They weren't just any people. They actually took and uprooted the best of the African population and enslave them in the United States. Does anyone have any questions? So, all right, so we'll continue, inshallah. So Bilali, we have now the story of Bilali, inshallah. All right. Okay, inshallah. All right. He was born in West Africa to a highly educated family. He was captured as a teenager, and he lived in Sapelo Island, which is also in Georgia. He was such a great leader because, again, he came from a strong, educated family. He managed the slaves that were on the plantation. There was actually a British attack. So the Muslim slaves that were in that area, he was led by them. They resisted the attack. And they're actually rewarded by the governor that they resisted the British attack when that happened. And this was, again, during the Revolutionary War era. And then, this is the interesting thing. That's his handwriting. And what is that? Bilali wrote a diary that was later discovered, and they thought it was just scribbles or a diary. It was actually, it's a treatise based on an Islamic scholar that was taught in West Africa in the time. I think it was like Maliki Madhab, actually. It's a 13-page text of basic laws, and it talks about salah. It talks about wudu. And it's about 13 pages, and is considered the mother text of American Islamic literature because it was the first it's like a textbook, the first Islamic textbook in 1857. And it was remained with him until his death. So he wrote it from memory and he used it. All right. We have, and then inshallah I'll start speeding up a little bit. Salih Bilali. Salih Bilali, all known as Old Tom. He was from West Africa as well. Sold into the plantation of the Bahamas. And then he was brought to the United States. He was a manager of 450 slaves. So again, I'm going to keep repeating this. The natural instinct, the natural leadership qualities of these people that went through correct tarbiyah, they couldn't take some of those things away from them. So even though they forced them to change their names, and some of them, they no longer showed their practice of Islam, their leadership qualities still came through. And they always made them the leaders. So he led 450 slaves. The reason why this is important. So again, in a lot of these instances, people are like, oh, this person wasn't Muslim. It was reported by the slave master's son that on his deathbed, he said, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah in English, Allah is God and Muhammad is the Prophet. So on his deathbed. This is another interesting, he's Hajj Umar ibn Sa'id. He was an Islamic scholar. And his story is a story, it's a very intriguing story. He was born in West Africa, brought over as a slave. He lived in slavery for 70 years. He was one of the recorded to have lived, about 104. Some people exaggerate and may say 140 because they were like, he's really old. So they don't know, but they're estimating that he was at least 104 years old. His is a very interesting story as well. He was again from Senegal. So he was a slave in South Carolina and then escaped to North Carolina. When he was recaptured in North Carolina, the reason why we have in Islam that if you cannot practice your religion in an area, Allah's going to ask us, why didn't you leave and immigrate? Allah's land is wide and vast. Ardullah wasi'a, right? So he was unable to practice at all in South Carolina. They basically broke him. And he said, no, I refuse. So he escaped. He was one of the few that was able to escape, but he was recaptured in North Carolina. But even with that, it's very interesting, his story, because in his autobiography, which on the next page, this is in the Library of Congress, so you can read this. So he wrote it in Arabic, and he wrote it in English. And he says, he starts off, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Right? And he says, the greatest being and our Lord, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, is the prophet or is a messenger. So the interesting thing about this is he was actually, they were said that he had converted to Christianity because he had been baptized about 10 years before his death. Very interesting, because he wrote this after. He wrote this after he was supposedly baptized. So this was one of the pseudo-conversions. So some people ended up having to say, I'm a Christian or whatever, and he still wrote this in Arabic and in English. And this was, again, 10 years after, and he had multiple Qur'ans in English and in Arabic. And that he said, that was my greatest treasure. The reason that they're saying is the pastor who baptized him, once he became a Christian, supposedly, they didn't make him, he was old, he's now a Christian. They didn't make him do a lot of work duties. But he essentially, again, was able to, he was able to maintain his faith even though he distracted them. Lizzie Gray was another one, and she was in South Carolina. And again, you notice that a lot of these people, again, they split them up. So in the United States, there's very little evidence, almost no evidence, that any Muslim family was kept together. They isolated them and separated them. So why is this important? So all of this narrative that happens with all of that's going on with this history. Look, I jumped, right? This is 1929. Before that, we had the slave trade, and there's like a large missing piece of history. So this is one of the oldest masajid in the United States. In the top left, that's what it used to look like. It's in North Dakota. And the history behind that basically was there was a group of Lebanese and Syrian people that came to that area. It was about 100 or so. They actually had families at that point, and they created this masjid. Today, in 1979, it got in disrepair because it wasn't being used, because it's kind of like in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota. So they brought it down, but then they, a few years, more recently, they raised funds and then rebuilt it. It's a very small place. We're talking about maybe from these front chairs to here, and you can see like the rug. It's a very, very small location. You can kind of see the people praying inside it, like two rows, one for men and one for women. This is another mosque. This is probably one of the second oldest mosques. This was in 1932 in Iowa. Iowa, what? North Dakota and Iowa? Really? Yes. So subhanAllah, that's actually this is another first permanent place that was a masjid. And again, so when people say, oh, they're all on the coasts and we all came to big cities, no. Islam was established in all of the states of the United States of America. So we'll go into the next era, right? Nation of Islam. So quickly, if you allow me. Edward Wilmot Blyden was basically a guy who was the father of Pan-Americanism. And really it was Pan-Africanism. Essentially the idea was that all of the Africans needed to unite. This guy's not a Muslim, but he actually was influenced by a guy called Duce. And he he influenced the guy Blyden into a lot of these things about unity, about we need to rewrite the history, we need to take back, because Christianity, what was Christianity during that time for blacks? Christianity during that time was the Ku Klux Klan. They were using the cross, they were using Christianity to destroy the Africans and African Americans that had come to the US under the slave trade. Why? So after the Civil War, which we know there's Muslims that fought in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and the way we know that is there's tombstones in some of these old cemeteries that have a finger pointing up. There's no other marker like a cross or a star with a hand with one finger pointing up and facing towards Mecca. So we have Muslims that fought and defended our country from the very beginning. Because a lot of these brought them over, like camel drivers, etc., knew a lot about resources and supplies, and they actually, some of them were not necessarily enslaved, some of them were actually brought as basically military consultants. They're brought over from the Middle East to help with the war efforts. So their idea of Christianity was, in the black context, was Christianity was a white religion. Jesus was Scandinavian. Jesus is supposed to be from the area Shem, from Philistine. He's supposed to have dark hair, darker skin, but he's now Scandinavian. So Edward Blyden basically came up with this idea that we need to take this back. So what he said was, we need to move away from this white Christianity and start unifying under a banner of us as Africans. So one of them being Edward Blyden was kind of like a mentor. A lot of his writings were used by Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was the person who founded the Nation of Islam. He took a lot of the principles of Islam. He put himself as a prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, after the Prophet Muhammad, and basically created a religion. Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, he was a troublemaker when in his youth. He was, I read his autobiography by Alex Haley. That's actually one of his mugshots on the top left. He used to actually straighten his hair with chemicals and things like that. He used to wear like a zoot suit, which is like one of those really oversized suits, comically oversized, and he was like a hustler. He would grifter, trick people into doing things. And he was arrested many times, and eventually he was put in prison for quite a while. And then he learned about basically the idea that the oppression that the white man had put on blacks. The problem was with the Nation of Islam is the context was, it was all about black nationalism. And they changed a lot of the principles and basically said, black is good, white is the devil. And subhanAllah, as the evolution of Malcolm X went through, he actually brought Muhammad Ali, one of the people that brought Muhammad Ali, who's the center figure standing next to him, he brought him into the Nation of Islam and was one of his mentors. As time went on, he started, Elijah Muhammad is not a prophet. He had many, many children outside of wedlock with many of his assistants, and it kept happening in every place. Many of them would have pregnancies all of a sudden, and then they would hide them, and then they would hide them. And then he was the one that basically, he was a whistleblower. He blew the whistle. He said, this is wrong, and he was the spokesperson. And he came out. And what happened was he went to Hajj. Thereafter, he was excommunicated. He said, I need to see Islam. So he went to Hajj. And you can see here, this is Muhammad Ali's mosque, Al-Qal'a in Egypt, him praying. He went to Hajj and he experienced something that he couldn't have experienced in any other place. He saw people from all over the world wearing the same colors and united, praying under one God. He said, this is Islam. So he came back and he actually founded his own mosque, the Mosque Cares. Warith Muhammad, who was actually one of the son of Elijah Muhammad, he actually was part of that movement. But 11 months later, he was assassinated, Malcolm X, by Nation of Islam operatives and potentially some agencies, etc., because he was a danger, right? He actually, you can see this picture, people are like, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, they were like, hated each other. Actually, they were very good friends. And Malcolm X reportedly told him, I'll be the boogeyman. I'm going to scare them. And I want you to be the good guy that they will go to because they don't want me. They don't want blacks to be like me. They want to be like you. So he's like, I'll take it. He didn't care about what history said. He's like, for our people, I'm willing to do this. So he became the scare, and everyone was scared of Malcolm X. He was a militant, even though he took no physical action. His rhetoric shook people. Go online, listen to his lectures. It shook people. He would say, Islam teaches us, etc., and they didn't know what this is. So this was the reality of Islam in the United States. Muhammad Ali became, as I said, he became Muslim, First Nation of Islam, and then he became a Sunni, Muslim like all of us, correct Muslim, not Nation of Islam. He was history making. At the age of 22, he beat Sonny Liston in the photograph. He's a young guy, and he basically said, that's when he said, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. When he became Muslim, the Vietnam effort was happening, and he was drafted. So they said, you have to come and serve in the military. He said, no. My faith teaches me this is a wrong war. I'm not going to go kill innocent people for no reason. They, at his ripe age, at his prime, they took his titles, they took his license, and he was unable to box for years. He became an activist and went around campuses and said, we need to fight, we need to resist against the oppression that we are committing against the Vietnamese, etc. His case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in a unanimous decision. When have you heard of a unanimous decision in the Supreme Court? When is the last time you've heard? I mean, these don't happen very often, but in a 8-0, they ruled in his favor, and they didn't just say you're not guilty, they removed it, because it was for prison for 5 years and a fine, etc. So the boxing league should not have stripped him. So they stripped him of his title, and then he was prosecuted. And they stripped him of all of his accolades and his license. So he won his case, and he became what we know today. His star, the Hollywood Walk of Fame, the only star that's not on the ground. He said, my name is Muhammad. I'm named after the Prophet, alayhi salatu salam. No one steps on the Prophet's name. So he is the only star of all of the stars that has his star not on the ground. It's on the wall, as you can see. Subhanallah. We now we jump forward. MashaAllah, we now have 3 serving Congress people. Keith Ellison was the first Muslim congressperson from Minnesota. He's now the Attorney General of Minnesota. Andre Carson was the second serving from Indiana, which is close by here. And then Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, and Ilhan Omar took kind of like over the seat, and she won. First two to U.S. Congress, and Ilhan being refugee, black, minority, hijabi. So, mashallah, Andre Carson actually serves as the head of the subcommittee on counterterrorism in the U.S. Congress, on the Intelligence Committee. We have Muslim athletes, Hakeem Olajuwon, Shaquille O'Neal, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Ibtihaj Muhammad, of different eras, right? This is a classic picture of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. All Muslims. This is astronaut Ansari. She's originally from Iran, but she actually flew under the flag of the United States because she lived here so long, she became United States citizen. First Muslima. She's actually the first Muslim, period, that flew under the American flag that was a Muslim that was an astronaut that flew into space. And she's a Muslim woman. This is actually the co-founder of YouTube. He's actually, if you go online, you may recognize this video. It's kind of funny. But he was the first person that uploaded a video onto YouTube many, many years ago. So his video is the oldest one, the first one. He's actually Muslim, originally from Bangladesh. And as we move forward, and inshallah we'll move into the questions, what we have, U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations. In 1965, the immigration laws changed. This is why the history is very spotty. You see these eras of slavery, Columbus area or the Columbian era, and then you see kind of the Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, the Nation of Islam, the issues that had happened there, and then their eventual movement towards true Islam. Now we go into the current era. In the 60s, people started to be able to immigrate. They changed the laws. America was very protectionist, and subhanAllah, they want to make it protectionist again. They want to change the laws back to the way it was, which is most of us wouldn't be here, right? Because most of us are immigrants, our parents, our grandparents are immigrants, etc. So in 1965, they changed the laws. And after that, a lot of students that came out of a lot of these Islamic movements left their countries. They came to the United States because the United States had freedom. They would gather, associate, practice their religion, and excel. These weren't just anybody. These were the best people in all of these areas. So of late, the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations was founded. And what the idea was is the people that founded a lot of the organizations, CARE, MLFA, MAS, United Muslim Relief, Islamic Relief, all of these people, they were actually the same group of people initially. And they said, we need something that's going to unify us, truly. So instead of it being one organization where they have the top down, where one organization leads, which was the idea originally of ISNA, but it didn't quite work out. What they did was they created the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, and now each one of these organizations has a seat at the table as part of this council. And they have a unified message, and they're trying to take back the message of America, American Muslims, and the organizations that we have in the United States. So the future is bright. So although we had lots of trials and challenges, we saw the history of all of those Muslims that overcame over time. And we need to unify. We need to break down the barriers that we have, and we need to learn and improve ourselves. Like Imam Hassan al-Banna said, أصلح نفسك وادع غيرك, meaning you improve, you learn, you develop yourself, and in parallel, you don't just sit on a side, go to a school. In parallel, you go, you learn, and you teach others the small amount you know. And the Sahabi, radiallahu anhum, they weren't just, the Quran is a great feat and we should be encouraged. But many of the Sahabi would say, because their idea of memorizing the Quran was implementation. So you had many of the core Sahabi, it took them years or months to memorize Surah Al-Baqarah because they take 10 ayahs and implement it. And they teach others. And they'd learn, implement, teach others. And it just keeps going. And then when everyone did that, that is the power of Islam. Islam didn't come, the golden age of Islam was not the goal of Islam. That was a byproduct. And as people moved away from Islam, the golden era and the golden age of Islam ended. And we had all of these trials and tribulations. So what do? The people that are the best in their fields, the top, they are the Muslims that follow Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the correct path of Islam, and that brings, we will get success in dunya because of that Islam, not the reverse. We serve Islam, and Islam then serves us in dunya and al-akhirah, in here, in our worldly affairs, and in the hereafter, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khairan kathiran to Dr. Zaini for his very interesting and I think eye-opening talk about the history of Islam in the US. So we have like 10 minutes for Q&A. Anybody have any questions? There's a sister over there.
Yes, so the Mandingo. So many of these people that I actually showed were from those areas, from the Mandinka area. Something that I didn't present, I didn't have a picture of it, but in Trinidad, the Mandinka people or the Denke people of the Senegal, Gambia, the Western Africa region, they actually were Trinidad. Again, they were able to buy their freedom. Some of them actually served in the military, and they didn't get their rights. So there was Imam John Muhammad Bath, Muhammad Usese, and a guy by the name of Harvey. They actually wrote to the Queen of England. So they had written to the king, and they wrote to the governor of Trinidad and told them, we demand our freedom. We want to pay our way out. And they said no. So after what had happened with Muhammad Usese, he had the right that he should have either gotten land or a pension. They said, we are businessmen. We actually are part of this economy. We will leave our businesses. We will leave our land. We want to go home. So they wrote to the Queen Victoria, Queen of England. She actually took their audience, 3 of them. And subhanAllah, they were able to pay their way out. They got their freedom, and they were able to return back home. So that Mandinka, and the reason why is because you have pictographs, sculptures in the United States that have African features that are part of Native American culture, is because these Mandinka people, which are part of the same people, and before that, Mensa Abu Bakr, the Mandinka people, they came early and they integrated into the Native American culture. And some of the Constitution, the Iroquois Nation Constitution, comes from a lot of principles from Islamic law and politics and governance. And that was the Iroquois Nation, and the dress changed. So you had the Mandinka people coming before and even during the slave trade, and they had a major, major impact on the United States. We'll go here and then over there. Okay.
All right. So you touched base this a little bit with the Malcolm X story.
Yes.
So I read that till this day that there's still a high rate of conversion to Islam
Yes.
in our prison systems
Yes.
in the U.S. So what's happening there?
So some organizations such as CARE, the question was in regards to, there's still a lot of conversions or reversions or re-embracing Islam from these people that are in prison. There are some efforts, but there needs to be more where people, CARE, if you have CARE as a local chapter, they have prison chaplaincy where you don't necessarily need to be specifically a full-fledged chaplain, but people that could lead Jummah, answer questions, take things, help the prisoners. So there are some programs, not enough, that are taking place in some of the prison systems where the services are being provided to some of the prisoners. But we need to do more because, as we've seen, they were left and forgotten. Our brothers and sisters that came and were forced here, and they're reverting. Islamic scholars that are in the United States, Abdullah Hakim Quick, Siraj al-Hajj, are saying they're not just, it's innate in them. It's not just the normal fitrah of a human being. It's their fitrah because their ancestors were Muslims. They came as Muslims and they held on to their Islam as much as they could. And they're returning. Why? Because people are discovering where they came from. And they came from Islam and they want to return to Islam. And that's there's Abdullah Hakim Quick has a lecture where he talks about if you have the last name Williams or Burns, there's a lot of last names that are associated, that there were people that came over, Turkish explorers from the Ottoman Empire, etc., that settled in the West Virginia area, and they actually were the ancestors of a lot of Americans. And when you go to Ancestry.com and you did the DNA, they're finding that they have lots of Muslim ancestors because of that. Yes, in the back. And then we'll go to you. Yes. Jazakallah khair. The Shriners Organization? Okay. So the little that I've researched in regards to the Shriners Organization is it was an American businessman that basically, it's not something that is not affiliated with the Masons, but basically he created an organization. We have a few other ones, Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Club, etc. And they're basically volunteer organizations. And he traveled and he saw a lot of the images of the fez, of the sword, the curved sword, etc. It's not something specific to Islam. They adopted, the founder of Shriner that was with him, adopted some of the imagery. So it's kind of like, it's not necessarily like a Nation of Islam kind of story, but similar in the sense that they adopted some ideologies and some imagery from it, but it's not directly connected to Islam in that way. It's something that's a reality in the United States. Yes, you had a question? Yeah. Yes. Right. No, so what I was saying in the Ottoman Empire was south. I was talking about south, the Senegambian region, the West Africa that was not part of, you're correct. The Ottoman Empire did extend through North Africa. I'm sorry for the confusion. It did extend through North Africa, but what I was mentioning beside it, and I think just the juxtaposition kind of put it together, was the sub-Saharan era kind of broke down, and they tried to keep into their Islam, but they did not necessarily have the support of the Ottoman Empire because the Ottoman Empire did not extend down in there after the Mali kingdoms fell. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Commerce. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The same tax, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that history, I think it started like that, but they actually officially wrote to the president and actually recognized it because they sent to all of the leaders. And Morocco, they actually signed a treaty. So it started off as a trade because they had to make that trade because a lot of the American, the people who were here were they were traders in a sense. So I think it started off like that, but the Sultan of Morocco, and probably through the agreement of the Ottoman Empire, most likely, he actually acknowledged and recognized it and said, and they sent an ambassador. So they actually had, it wasn't just the first Muslim country, it was the first country, period, the first world leader, period, that acknowledged the United States as a freestanding, free country in its own right. So by extension, that would mean also the Ottoman Empire and the rest of the Islamic Empire at that time also recognized because Morocco was part of the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Is there any other questions? Did you have a question? Jazakallah khair. That's an excellent question, actually. So his question was, are the Muslims here, did many of them come from immigrants, or did a lot of them come from slavery? So it's mixed. So it really depends on what you're looking at. Most of the people that are Muslims in the United States, the ones that we see are the ones that are immigrants or children of immigrants, right? They came from overseas. But there's a large unknown population of the people that came, and they tried as much as possible to connect with Islam and stay connected with Islam, but there was a large portion of those people that came as slaves were Muslims. But the problem was they didn't let them practice, and they didn't let them speak, they didn't let them pray. So a lot of them lost it over time, but you still even have to this day African Americans that are calling themselves Omar and Aisha and Khadija and Fatima and all of these names. It's not random. The reason is because this is their history, and Islam is their history, and that's why you have a massive adoption. So we, as people that came as immigrants, we need to, or children of immigrants, we need to unify and bring all of those things together. So it shouldn't matter that it is an immigrant or someone who's native, meaning native, that they came through the slave trade. They came before the latest wave of immigrants. But the United States, we are all immigrants. So we have that opportunity. So we here, as Muslims in the United States, we come from countries where Muslims are the majority, okay? But we're here as a minority, and it's not a bad thing. We're just like the minorities of many other minorities that came. So we need to think, and Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, you can find it online. There's a PDF in Arabic and in English. Fiqh al-aqaliyat, meaning the understanding, Islamic understanding of minorities. And Dr. Hamad Ghazali touched on some of those yesterday in talking about the fiqh understanding of awlawiyat, priorities, or muwazanat, weighing things and seeing what benefits and the costs are of things. These things we need to learn, and we need to process and teach others, because that's our understanding as minorities, that we have power, and as minorities we all are in this together, and we shouldn't let race or language or affiliation change or divide us. Because as we saw that happen, as the nationalism rises and all of those things rise, what connects us and what makes us all here is that we're Muslim. That's it. That is it. Most of us speak different languages. We come from a different ancestry, but we're Muslim. So that's what I want to leave you with, is our history is rich, our history is deep. We need to learn it. We need to take it back, and we have a lot of opportunity. And this conference is one of those opportunities. And inshallah, tomorrow there's also the mass convention, so anyone in the area that has the flexibility, the mass convention is also starting, is going to be for a few days, that also has a large gathering of Muslims. 25,000 Muslims come to the convention. So after this one, you finish this one, come join us in the mass convention, inshallah, as well. And you can see 25,000 Muslims from all different countries, immigrants and people that converted, reverted, embraced Islam from the United States. That's what we need. We need to unify under that banner, learn who we are, and teach others, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan kathiran again to the speaker. With that, I would like to remind participants if they could spare some time to go online at program.muktamar.us to fill out a survey so that we can better improve the Muktamar in the future, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Oh, you have one more question?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Okay.
No. So the Mandinka, going back to that. So yes, there was, based on Mansa Abu Bakr and the Muslim explorers that came to the United States and stayed here, and that they went through the Southwest, they went up the Mississippi River, which is basically through the middle of the country, they actually stayed. and their cultures actually impacted the cultures here of the Native Americans. And there's a lot of beliefs that the Native Americans have that are very, very similar. Wallahu a'lam, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us that He sent messengers and prophets to all nations. So when you look at even some of the things that are very, very old in the Asian cultures, they have a lot of things that are very, very similar to the message of Islam. But there's some technicalities that are different. They believe in spirits, which is like the Native Americans. But again, that can be explained in the sense that they had an idea of the connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala originally, and over time, as it got filtered and things got lost, they all went towards spirit and this unseen world, and a lot of talk about the unseen. We know about the unseen, and we know about the spirits, our souls, and about the angels and the jinn, etc. So the Native Americans have that in their culture, and there's lots and lots of evidence that the Muslims were here, and they had a major impact on the dress, even of how they used to wear their clothes. The Mandinka over, and they started dressing. The women would wear head coverings. The men would basically wear like a shawar khamis or a thawb at times. So this is part of that history as well. But again, even with the Native Americans, a lot of their history has been suppressed, has been overwritten. And they're trying to take back what it is because they wanted them basically put to the side so everyone else could do whatever they want. So we need to unite with them as well, inshallah.
One more.
Yes.
It's a very long time.
Okay. It is. It is. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Right. So I think that we have that people were lost here, and they're trying to find that a lot of the Islamic movement didn't necessarily come here until immigration opened up. So that's why you don't see lots of evidence of standing masajid in the United States in the 1900s. There are indications that people used to gather in certain areas, but nothing that was a dedicated masjid in that way. The connection between that and human rights is that was what was unlocking. People were looking at the freedom from the dunya. So that's where they took some of the principles in the Nation of Islam example. They took some of the principles of Islam and mixed it in. But then they mixed in it a nationalistic superiority and where it's very ethnocentric. And they were trying, because they were fighting. So they adopted an ideology and created an ideology around the idea that they wanted to take back. Because Islam does promote human rights, defense of the defenseless, protecting the weak, fighting against oppression with your hand, your tongue, your heart, those types of things, the unity. So they're taking those principles. So subhanAllah, even people like the Ahmadiyya, who are not necessarily Muslim, Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, they again have a similar type of story where they have a founder who took some of the that he was like a messenger or prophet and created some things. And there's a lot of African Americans who became Ahmadiyya as well, and then eventually became Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, Sunni Muslims, because again, they're looking. People have this innate, and the people here especially have the innate need, the fitrah. They are looking for the answer. And when they find it in Islam. But unfortunately, some people got to it before us. They said it's Islam. It's not really Islam. But they took some of those principles and they held those things dear to them. So our job, our role is really to not only set the example, but we need to learn this history, what the reality is here, and then teach others what it truly is. Because outsiders don't know. They don't know the difference. So we need to know, and it's not to create friction and division. It's to understand so that we can better serve and acknowledge what the history is here, what the reality is of the Muslims here, so that we can move forward into the future and unify. But again, we first need to know who we are. The example of the Prophet ﷺ, the first 13 years, it was who they needed to know Allah. And then they started getting the regulations. But they first knew Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who He was first. So they taught themselves the connection and made that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then they started talking about the rules and regulations, etc. So that's our example, the prophetic model of how He dealt with these tribes that were non-Muslim, and how the Prophet's example is the example we use, not necessarily just the ahadith without any context, where we take a hadith that's sahih, it's correct hadith, and then just try to apply it. We have to see how it was applied and how the scholars of fiqh and the understanding of how this hadith needs to be applied. So that's what we need to look at. Even in science, a lot of people are engineers and things like that. When you're proving something, you have to look at history. You need to look at what is in the science. If anyone did a dissertation or did a master's thesis, you have to go into the literature and say, this is what the literature says. This is what I'm saying. It's slightly different. Slightly different. So there's a body of knowledge that you first need to understand before you become a scholar. We're all students of knowledge. I'm not a scholar. We're all students of knowledge. So we learn the tools and methodology that then we can go and deal mu'amalat, deal with the people. And that's how we need to learn, following the Prophet's model, alayhi salatu wasalam.
Jazakallah khairan. I would have to end the session right now because we have to make way for Zuhur. If anybody else has further questions, maybe inshallah we can come on a private. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.